Hello, I'm Paul Drinkwater, a guide with the Gloucester Civic Trust. In this video, I want to tell you about George Whitefield. George Whitefield, spelt with an E, but usually pronounced as Whitfield, was born on 16th of December 1714 in Southgate Street in Gloucester. In the Bell Inn, not the present New Bell Inn, but in the coaching house which was next door but was demolished to make way for Marks and Spencer's on the site presently occupied by the B&M store. He was the seventh and youngest child of Thomas and Elizabeth Whitefield, who kept the inn. The family had long associations with Oxford University, and many of his ancestors on both sides of the family were ordained priests in the Church of England. The family attended St Mary de Crypt Church, where the young George was baptised and later took his first communion. Unfortunately, when George was only 4 years old, his father died, and his mother remarried to an unscrupulous man who she left when he brought the family to financial ruin. This rather put paid to her plans for George to go to Oxford to study for the priesthood. It's said that the young George was a lively lad, prone to truancy and boyhood mischief, but had a real passion for acting. He briefly attended the King's School, but then transferred to the school next door to the St Mary de Crypt Church, where he gained most of his education. This was interrupted when he gave up schooling to help his mother and work as a pot boy in the inn. It seems then that his mother's ambition for him was a lost cause, until one day a visitor to the family home revealed that he was studying at Oxford by working as a servitor. Now, a servitor was a servant to the richer students. This meant doing menial duties and wearing servile clothing with limited privileges, but it did give him access to the university facilities in order for him to study towards a degree. George then returned to the Script School to complete his studies and went up to Pembroke College, Oxford, as a servitor and student at the age of 17. At Pembroke College, he came into contact with Charles and John Wesley and their Holy Club. This was a group of well-organised students who exercised their Christianity in biblical study and helping the poor. As a result of his reading Henry Scougal's book, The Life of God in the Soul of Man, George had a Damascus Road experience, converting him to a deep personal faith in which he became very passionate. Illness mid-study brought him back to Gloucester, where he enthusiastically shared his newfound faith with all and sundry, and met with other new Christian converts in small groups that later became the hallmark of the Methodist denomination when it was founded in 1744 by John Wesley. The new Bishop of Gloucester, Dr. Martin Benson, was greatly impressed with his enthusiasm for the gospel and agreed to ordain him as a deacon at the unprecedented early age of 21. He preached his first sermon on the 17th of June, 1736, in the pulpit of St Mary de Crypt, just a week after his ordination. It was reported that half of Gloucester was there. His sermon was received with mixed response. Some complained to the bishop that he had driven 15 people mad, to which the bishop, not too displeased with his prodigy, replied, "Well, I hope their madness lasts until next Sunday." The 18th century Church of England, however, was not so pleased with his evangelistic fervour and insistence that salvation was by the grace of God and not by good works. He was banned from most of the city churches. He did, however, preach in St John's, Northgate Street, but only because the vicar, who had refused him the pulpit, died suddenly and the church urgently needed a preacher. Returning to Oxford to complete his studies, he took over the leadership of the Holy Club when the Wesleys went as missionaries to the new American colonies. The Wesleys persuaded George to join them there, but whilst waiting for a ship to take him, he took a temporary post at the Tower of London Chapel and preached wherever he could, gaining a solid reputation. Increased hostility from the Church of England establishment took him to preaching in the open air, something quite unheard of at the time and considered much too undignified by the clergy. In 1738, he sailed to the new colony of Georgia, where he held the role of chaplain to the small community in the capital, Savannah. Whilst there, he became involved in the Great Awakening, an evangelistic revival movement that was sweeping the new colonies. He also founded the Bethesda Orphanage and returned to England after only 4 months to raise money for it. Back in England, he was ordained as a priest by the Bishop of Gloucester. Again, his preaching was well received by some, but more and more churches banned him from their pulpits. In Bristol, he preached in the open air to miners at Kingswood, who responded to his message in droves. He was supported by Selina, Countess of Huntingdon, and Whitefield became her chaplain. She financed many churches for him to preach in, including St Mary's Hall, an old theatre in St Mary's Square, Gloucester. But his heart was set in America, where he travelled no less than 7 times, preaching in all the new colonies there, and also in England, Scotland, Bermuda, Gibraltar, and the Netherlands. In 1741, he married Elizabeth James, a Welsh widow, and 2 years later they had a son called John. Sadly, the baby died after only 4 months of life and was buried in St Mary the Crypt on the 8th of February 1744. George Whitefield had a very loud, commanding voice which enabled him to address thousands at a time in the open air. David Garrick, a well-known actor of his day, was said to have commented, "I will give 100 guineas if I could say, 'Oh,' like Mr. Whitefield." He often acted out his sermons, and crowds listened to him in awed silence. A childhood attack of measles had left him with a squint in one eye, causing his detractors to nickname him Dr. Squintum. It was said you could never be quite sure if he was looking at you or not. Although an evangelist, he also exercised Christian compassion and set up an educational trust which led to the present-day University of Pennsylvania. A statue of him was erected in 1919 and stands outside the Philadelphia campus. He was against the slave trade from Africa, but he did buy slaves for his orphanage, although he looked after them well and bequeathed them to the Countess of Huntingdon along with the Bethesda Orphanage. It is claimed he was largely instrumental in bringing Christianity to African Americans. He died in September 1770 at the relatively young age of 55, having worn himself out with his extensive travel and preaching commitments. He was buried in the crypt under the pulpit of Old South Presbyterian Church in Newburyport, Massachusetts. As for his legacy, well, George Whitefield was a man for his time. After the Reformation of earlier years, by the 18th century, the Church of England had become very stuffy and legalistic once again. People attended church out of duty, and George Whitefield stirred them out of their complacency. His message was that salvation was a gift of grace, not to be earned by good works. In accepting this, his hearers could enter into a life-changing personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ and gain peace in their lives and a desire to serve others. When he returned to Gloucester after his conversion, he set up small groups to study the scriptures here. This idea was taken up by the Wesleys when the Methodist denomination was established in 1744. So we could claim that Whitefield was the inspiration for Methodism. Unfortunately, George Whitefield is largely forgotten today in this country, though still remembered in America. Back here in Gloucester, we have Whitefield Street, spelt without the E, named after him, and the URC Church in Park Road was built as a Whitefield memorial on the site of his last open-air service in Gloucester. Above the door are the words, "The love of Jesus Christ constrains me to lift up my voice like a trumpet," one of his many quotes. Let's finish with some of his quotes. "It is a poor sermon that gives no offence, that neither makes the hearer displeased with himself nor with the preacher. Take care of your life, and the Lord will take care of your death. More heathen morality and not Jesus Christ is preached in most of our churches. To preach more than half an hour, a man should be an angel himself or have angels for hearers." And my favourite, "We are immortal until our work on earth is done." There are also many stories about George Whitefield. This 10-minute talk is too short to relate them now. For that, you must read Arnold Dallimore's book, George Whitefield. My favourite story is the one about George and the highwayman. Thank you for listening.